My upbringing was unique in the sense that my parents split when I was very young. I was a baby, so I grew up with my mom and my stepdad here in California in the Bay Area, and my father, he lives in Florida, and we would spend most of our summers and vacations and whatnot in Florida visiting my dad. But for the most part, I was raised here in California, in the Bay Area, and it's just two very different communities. So a very small town in Florida, maybe like less than 10,000 people now, even less back then. Agricultural community, whereas the Bay Area is very urban, and lots of different people, diversity and whatnot. In terms of my religious upbringing, here in California, my parents were kind of like a-religious or secular in a way. So we didn't really go to church, we never went to church actually, unless it was for a wedding or funeral, and didn't really have any discussions about like God or the Bible or what have you. Whereas in Florida, my dad is a very devout Christian, and we would go to church regularly, not just on Sundays, but throughout the week for different types of activities like youth groups and whatnot. And some of my best childhood memories are having discussions with my dad about religion, about God, about God's plan for us, and kind of these kind of high-minded conversations around spirituality and religion and whatnot. So I kind of grew up in two different worlds with one foot in the other, and and I think that kind of laid the groundwork for my later spiritual development and explorations around religion. So as I got older, probably my late teens, I started having more of a interest in religion, where it kind of went beyond what my parents were just telling me. And I remember even starting to go to different churches when I was a teenager here in California. My parents here in California, my stepdad and my mom, they're good people, but I mean, they just weren't religious at all. They weren't against religion, but they certainly weren't for religion in a sense. So, I remember taking myself and finding friends at school who I could go to church with and whatnot, and kind of just exploring that. Because I feel like, even as a child, I had this kind of desire or yearning to have a relationship with God. By the time I turned maybe 17 or 18, I started to learn more about different world religions, and I didn't. It's funny because a lot of people who convert from Christianity to whatever other belief system, whether it's Islam or atheism or whatnot, in my experience, they find something wrong with Christianity that they can't swallow. Whereas for me, it was just a yearning for greater understanding of what else is there. So I had no problems with Christianity. I had no problems with the Bible or anything like that. In fact, I've always had a lot of respect for Christianity, and I still do to this day. But I just decided, it's silly to call myself a Christian without really exploring what else is out there. And so I actually made a conscientious decision to stop identifying as a Christian and just kind of, I call this my free agent years, because I was just kind of out there exploring whatever. But that eventually turned into not exploring anything at all, because, Christianity provided a structure on which to kind of base your lifestyle and all that other kind of stuff. And then I kind of just, I think maybe I got lazy with it and pursued other interests. And it wasn't until my very early 20s that I decided to really decide to explore religion again more seriously. And that's when I first started reading about Islam and asking people about Islam, because I had moved from to Oakland, which is a very diverse city, and I started meeting Muslims for the first time. Where I grew up, there weren't any Muslims or anything like that. There wasn't any mosques that I'm aware of at the time. And so now I was meeting other Muslims, and I started asking questions about Islam, and I ended up buying, I went to Marcus Books, which is this really famous bookstore in Oakland, and I bought an autobiography of Malcolm X and the Quran, and I read it one summer, and then I became Muslim. So that's kind of the short version of the story, To give you a little bit more background about kind of my upbringing, I got really heavily involved in the punk rock culture in my teens, and I spent a lot of my weekends going to concerts, playing in bands, playing music. Within the punk culture, there's a subculture called straight edge, which is basically kind of like a radical sobriety movement. So these were like punks who like didn't drink, didn't do drugs, didn't do any of that kind of stuff, and kind of resisted like the larger societal paradigm of like intoxication and giving in to your kind of like lower desires, if you will. And as a result of that, I also like got really heavily involved in environmentalism, animal rights. So I was very involved with like environmentalism and deep ecology. And I was reading the Quran, and there's these verses about, Allah creates everything, the mountains, sends rain from the sky, and, asking you to reflect upon that, And so now, and I really enjoy like going out into nature, going to hikes, going on trips. So whenever I'm in nature, I'm always like observing everything around me, and I'm thinking about it and like how complex everything is, And something about like just the Quran and, what it was asking of me while I was reading it, like just really spoke to me. And not only that, but because I was raised within an Abrahamic tradition, like I was already familiar with all the big players in the Quran. So, Abraham was in there, Noah was in there, Moses was in there. And again, because I was involved in kind of like this, from a very young age, this kind of movement that resisted mainstream culture in a sense, like with, straight edge, animal rights, environmentalism. The stories of the prophets in the Quran, they're radicals, they're rebels, you know what I mean? In the sense that they resisted whatever mainstream culture or society was presenting, and they were trying to guide people away from that to the truth. And something about that just spoke to me, like, immediately. And so I remember reading the Quran and also reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and probably the most significant, and I read these simultaneously, and I remember, when I kind of, it wasn't like an aha moment, it was more of like a soul development as I was reading these two books. But there was a particular part in the autobiography of Malcolm X where he's on Hajj and he's observing all the different Muslims from around the world, and he's talking about white Muslims and Arab Muslims and black Muslims and everyone getting together and, performing the rituals and whatnot. And I think that was like a big, that was an insightful like chapter, only because it made me realize that like Islam is for everybody. It's not an Arab religion or like an Eastern religion or whatever, but it's something that it's for everybody. So I became Muslim when I was 21 years old, so roughly 12 years ago. And when I first became Muslim, I had no idea about, because I was just reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and the Quran, really, that's pretty much it. So I was unfamiliar with the kind of, reveries of like, finer details of like early Islamic history and, schismatics and all that kind of stuff, or polemics for that matter either. In fact, I was introduced to polemics as a result of becoming more involved with the Muslim community. And so I did my Shahada at a mosque that was just down the street from my house at the time. I was living in downtown Oakland, and I just pulled up, Yelp or something like that and found a local mosque, and I called a bunch of them, finding out like, well, okay, so like what time do you guys have service and all this other kind of stuff. None of them answered the phone. So I ended up I'm just going to show up at like the mosque down the street. And it was probably like a Wednesday night or something like, it was like, a random time. And this is a mosque that has, they pray all the prayers there. And they happened to be praying Maghrib prayer, Salah. And so I just showed up there, and I had no idea what their like ideological bent was or any of that kind of stuff. But this was the mosque, it was, literally 10 minutes down the street from my home. So I started going there every single day because they were like, oh, we pray here every day. I'm like, okay, well, come here after work. And that's when I started like, interacting with different brothers. They introduced me to a couple other like, convert brothers, and just really trying to like, that's where I learned to pray, It turns out that was sort of a Salafi masjid. So, alhamdulillah, they were very welcoming, and they weren't, judgmental about like my tattoos or my appearance or anything like that, and they were very gentle in their kind of introduction. But as soon as I started talking about like, oh, like, have you guys heard about such and such masjid? Because I started associating with different members of the Muslim community, And somebody there told me, "Oh, brother, yeah, be careful at that masjid." I'm like, "Why?" I mean, because they're Sufis. And I was like, "Okay, well, what's wrong with that?" It's like, "They're not Sunni, brother." And I'm like, "Okay." And so, of course, like, my natural inclination was to go check out the Sufi masjid and see what was really going on, you know. And so, lo and behold, I really, liked what I was hearing at this Sufi mosque I was going to. And, then I started hearing about, I kind of was initiated into, kind of the deeper understanding of like Islamic spirituality through I would say like, well, what I would call like traditional Sunni Sufism, and was just really impressed by what I was like reading and hearing about. Traditional in the sense that like these were Sufis who followed the Shia and like prayed all their prayers and all that kind of stuff, and they weren't charismatic in the sense that they were doing a bunch of dancing or the kind of the stereotypical like image of Sufis that people have. And so, anyways, I was just really impressed with like the imam at this mosque, and was just really interested. And so that was the main mosque I was going to at the time. Later, I started becoming interested in Islamic history, and I started, of course, reading about some of the arguments for and against Shiism, and kind of the quote-unquote mainstream narrative that's presented in like Sunni communities. And I started asking, there was a website, and I don't even remember the name of the website, but somebody warned, "Oh, be careful, brother, because that might be a Shia website." And so now this reminds me of that incident that happened when the brother warned me about the Sufi mosque, because I ended up finding out about the Sufi mosque and I actually really liked it. And so now this guy's warning me about Shias. I'm like, "Well, what's wrong with that?" He's like, "Well, just be careful because they're not Sunni." I'm like, "Okay." So of course I'm going to go check out everything about Shiism that I possibly can. And I end up meeting a brother who's been a friend for many, many years, alhamdulillah. And he met with me and answered all my questions about Shiism. He's a convert brother who became Muslim and became Shi'i. And we met, and he gave me a couple books, and just any questions I had, he was able to answer. And the answers that he had were more satisfying, especially around the succession to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and but I would say the pivotal moment was learning about Karbala. That for me was just kind of the linchpin to the whole story, right? So after that, I just kind of I can recall that was what sparked my love for like reading and books, and just learning as much as I could about Islam, Islamic history, about the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. There's just something about the Ahlul Bayt that is like, so I told you I liked that Sufi imam, right? And this was some guy who was giving khutbahs on Fridays and stuff, and always had good advice, and was very intelligent and well spoken. Well, what happened was I started reading the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt, and I remember reading Najab Balaga, and some at the time there wasn't a lot of our other hadith or texts like that were translated well, but I had exposure to a lot of the narrations from the Ahlul Bayt and just reading their sermons and whatnot, and I was just like, wow, like this is like it's almost like you're there with them, and the imams of the Ahlul Bayt have a certain charisma that like just cannot be matched. And I think, just in the same way that we rely on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like to act as a, how do we know what God wants for us without having recourse to a prophet? Like by extension, like how do we know like what Allah wants from us, or how do we interpret like the Sunnah, for example, without having recourse to the imams from the Ahlul Bayt, so they just provided kind of a clarity for me that at the time, I think my first year as a Muslim, I was just immersing myself in all these different avenues, and then I finally found a home with Shiism. It took about a year to become Shia after I first became Muslim. By the time I was vegan, and I'd already been heavily involved with the straight edge scene, and so it's funny because a lot of people ask me like, oh, did you have to give up drinking or any of that? I'm like, no, I never drank or used drugs in my life. And also I was eating halal at the time by default because everything I ate was a vegetable. So it's funny because like in terms of lifestyle, there wasn't a whole lot to change in the sense that I had to like, give up a whole lot. But, Islam like enriched my life by providing a framework by which I could, get closer to God, and I believe that's like our purpose in life is to get as close to God as possible, understand His will for us, and follow that will to the best of our ability. And that's the literal definition of Islam is submission. So to God's will. So I would say that Islam has provided a very strong guidance and framework for me to develop a relationship with Allah. Because like I was saying, I had a relationship with Allah since I was very young, and I grew up in a non-Trinitarian church, so like, God the Father was always separate from Jesus the Son. We didn't identify Jesus as being, a God or anything like that. So, I've always tried to develop a relationship with like Allah since I was a very young child, and then I kind of just got really, just was kind of like searching, and through my late teens and early 20s, and once I learned about Islam for the first time, because buying that Quran and reading that was the first time I've ever even looked into Islam. So like I grew up in a post 9/11 world where like there was this like kind of like narrative that was an anti-Islamic, Islamophobic like narrative being presented to us regarding terrorism and whatnot. But because I've always had a very critical mind regarding like mainstream anything, I never really gave it too much thought, and but I also didn't associate with any Muslims. I didn't, there wasn't any, I don't remember seeing any like, Muslim women or men with like, like easily identifiable like Muslim people in my community at the time. But once I moved to a larger city, urban environment, there was a lot more diversity. I mean, there's probably close to at least 50 mosques in the Bay Area alone, I would imagine. What's my relationship like with the Ahlul Bayt? I think about the Ahlul Bayt all the time. So, and it's so hard for me to put into words because, one thing that I've come to understand over the last 30 odd years of my life has been that, God is so close to us, but He's also so, incomprehensible, right? And that's part of the nature of being a perfect, being is our inability to comprehend Him. And so like when I think about the Prophet Muhammad and you really truly learn about him and his seerah and about the Ahlul Bayt, like it's almost like they're so close to you, but they're incomprehensible too, because it's like, how are these normal human beings? And they're not, so and when you're being advised by like Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam or whoever else, like when you're reading a hadith, it's different than being told like, what to do or, how to do something by somebody else. So it's very difficult for me to describe my relationship with them other than that, they just like, I hope that I can develop my relationship with them, further. So, I mean, I've been Muslim for about 12 years, which is almost, half of my life. And I would say that, when you look at when we look at the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, alayhi salam, they're role models for us. And what does that mean? It means that we must follow, they're an example for us, so we have to follow their example. And when you look at their character and their actions and the way they treated people, the way they associated with, they were kind to everybody. They were firm against, oppressors. They were humble and welcoming and kind and charitable. And I would say that, my religious journey is, moving forward is to strive to be more like them in as many ways as possible. whereas at the same time, not losing myself in, the kind of, I would say like converts to Islam or, and also just Muslims in general can be very overzealous in a lot of ways. They can be prideful in a lot of ways, and I certainly can look back at my life and in my early days as a Muslim and, learning about all this knowledge, right? And kind of like the burden of knowledge that results in kind of like thinking you know better. So, but when you really think hard about it, it's, that's not what knowledge is for. It's to refine ourselves and refine our character. So I would say that I've attempted to make a shift towards that direction. In fact, that's why I didn't want to do this interview to begin with, because I kind of felt like, well, I'm not important, so who cares? Well, it's like, but I figured it'd be, maybe there's going to be some tattooed guy who's thinking about Islam and sees me, and, if that's the case, I'll do it, But certainly there was a time when in my early, career as a Muslim, if you will, was that I was just very, I love to just, learn about things and kind of, show it off or whatever, and talk about, be able to contend with other people, in discussions and whatnot, And now I just try to keep an open mind, and I try to think about, what would Muhammad do? So I think we need to start, making, what would Muhammad do bumper stickers.